Boom. All right. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much all for being here. I'm really excited about tonight's program. This is one that we've been thinking about doing for a while, and I'm really excited that we're finally getting around to doing it. My name is Edward. I am president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and welcome to our virtual COVID-born program series, Birds Bytes. It's basically a riff on the Birds and Beers programs we used to hold back when we could all actually gather in big groups in bars. But we're just really excited to have this. This is, I think, our 15th program here that we've been going every month all through the year and year and a half now. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to pass it over to Sarah in just a moment here. But just some quick notes again. Please make sure that you stay muted for the duration of her presentation. We don't want to have like weird background noise. I've had people doing dishes and dogs barking and everything in between. So let's just avoid that if we can. I will be coming through here with the mute hammer. So just to keep things nice and quiet. The other thing too is we will have time for questions. I'm going to ask you guys to put your questions in the chat box as they come up, and then we'll answer them at the end of the program. So when Sarah's done, we'll then actually ask you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question in person, keep things a little bit more personal here. But yeah, so put those in the chat box and hold those till the end. And then I think those are the main issues here. So I don't want to sit here and talk all day. Just additionally, check out our website, chicagobirder.org, for future events, Birds and Bytes, Patch Tat, and in-person events now as well. We would love to see you at any number of these. So I think without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Sarah. Take it away.
All right, can you all see my screen? Good. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited this evening to talk to you about the Notorious Cowbird. So if you would, let's say, post a photo of a brown-headed cowbird on social media, like in this case, Twitter, you might get comments like this. Like, I know that's a brown-headed cowbird, the most neglectful parents of the bird world. It isn't just random private Twitter users that will hate on cowbirds. Here's a tweet from the US Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Birds account that says, it's National Invasive Species Awareness Week, and in the bird world, that means brown-headed cowbirds. Learn about what you can do to help prevent the spread of invasive plants and animals. This is kind of funny because, as we'll talk about later, brown-headed cowbirds are not invasive species. And so this tweet was wrong on many levels, but it was interesting to see this amount of anti-cowbird propaganda, if you will, coming from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. This isn't new to social media and it's not recent. Here's a book from 1966 called Never Trust a Cowbird. I've not had a chance to read this. And if you have, consider yourself lucky. I tried to buy this book and it is $855 on Amazon. If you would just Google the name brown-headed cowbird, you'll get questions like, are cowbirds bad? Should you kill cowbirds? How do I get rid of cowbirds? In general, people just don't like cowbirds, and that has led people to actually destroy cowbird eggs or kill adult cowbirds. And this is a big enough problem, it's pervasive enough that Audubon actually released this article asking, is it okay to remove cowbird eggs from host nests? Their byline is, it can be tempting to interfere with these brood parasites, but there are many reasons, legal and behavioral, to leave tampering to the pros. So before I dive in, I want to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Sarah Winnicki. I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm going to throw up my contact information again at the end of the talk, but here's my Twitter and everything in case you want to tweet some mean things about cowbirds as I go. I'm a field biologist, so I'm generally not very polished looking. I generally look like this, working with birds in the field. In this case, this is all my work in Kansas. And I'm going to be showing some pictures of nests and of adult birds that I'm holding. I have the training and permission to approach these nests and to handle birds. Don't do this at home. Don't go to nests, don't get photos. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. And obviously don't catch adult birds. I've been a birder since I was a child. So here's a picture of me at 11 years old looking at some gulls in Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm from. I was lucky enough to be part of the Ohio Young Birders Club organization, which was a club for 12 to 18-year-olds. And without this group and the support and learning about conservation, giving presentations and things like that, I wouldn't be where I am today. And that even led me to some really neat opportunities, like going to the Galapagos Islands as an intern for an ecotourism company. In general, I'll just say support your young birders. They're the conservationists of the future. When I went to Denison University for my undergraduate work, there were no ornithologists there. So I did spend some time curating an old bird collection from the 50s, but I had to look off campus for research opportunities. So after my freshman year, I did some work with red-winged blackbirds on the Lake Erie Islands with the Ohio State University. And then after my sophomore year, I joined the Boyle Lab at Kansas State University. So this is a really fun bunch of people. We study both grassland birds and tropical birds, the dancing little mannequins that you might have seen in videos. I worked in the grassland end, which you might think is the more boring end, but I'll try to convince you it's not. And we all worked with Alice Boyle here. I hope you can see my pointer. I'm circling her as we're ice skating together. Now I work with Drs. Mark Halber and Dr. TJ Benson at the University of Illinois. Dr. Halber in particular is kind of notorious for his work with cowbirds. This is actually the sign outside of our laboratory, big bright neon cowbird lab. So quite often when I give this talk, I'll title it Cowbirds, Villainous Mobsters or Falsely Malign Native Species, a Biologist's Perspective. And so my goal for today is to first introduce the concept of brood parasitism. So I'm going to talk about not only cowbirds, but also some of the other really cool brood parasites, and I'll explain what that all means. And then I'm going to convince you that cowbirds are actually villainous mobsters and that we should hate them. And then I'll turn around and convince you that there are falsely maligned native species. And then I'll wrap it up with talking about cowbirds in research, focusing in on the labs that I've worked in, just because I know them the best. So when you hear the word parasite, you might think of blood-sucking insects or perhaps the award-winning movie, but I'm talking today about a special case of parasitism. This is called brood parasitism, and it's when organisms rely on others to raise their young. This strategy appears in birds, obviously, but also insects and fishes. So here are some fish nests. They very well may contain eggs from other individuals, and the parents are caring for those eggs in addition to their own babies. So when I talk about parasites, the parasite is the one that lays its eggs in host nests, and that's the terminology I will be using. So we'll start off with one type of parasitism. This is conspecific brood parasitism, con for same, specific for species. So this is often called egg dumping, and it's when a bird will lay her eggs in the nest of the same species. This is pretty common in ducks, like these goldeneye here. The female bird will make her own nest, lay her own eggs, take care of her own babies, but may also lay some additional eggs in the nests of other goldeneye. So why might she do this? Predation is likely one of the answers here. Predation is the #1 risk to breeding birds. In some systems, the majority of nests are actually eaten by predators before the babies can even leave. So here is a snake that I found in a robin nest that I was working with this summer. Obviously the babies didn't make it. So if mom had built this nest and laid all of her eggs just in this nest, she would lose her entire reproductive effort when the snake hit the nest. But if she had spread her eggs out into different nests, into other robins' nests, perhaps some of her own babies will make it out alive. So this could be one reason why we see this conspecific brood parasitism, this egg dumping between different nests. And this isn't too much of a problem for the host parents, especially in something like a duck. So an adult duck doesn't feed, it paddles around in a lot of cases with a ton of babies. And those babies aren't fed by as I said, they're not fed by the parents. They're often just shepherded around, and the parents protect them and take them to food resources. And in fact, having more babies overall makes it less likely that your babies will get eaten. So if a predator comes and grabs one baby, just based on probability, it's less likely to be your own if somebody else's babies are also there. But this isn't necessarily as cost-free for altricial birds. These are the birds that raise their own babies in the nest that have to feed them. Having an extra baby would be costly. So in a lot of cases, there's ways that these birds will prevent parasitism because of the cost of parasitism. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. That leads me to my next type of brood parasitism, and this is heterospecific brood parasitism. Hetero meaning different, specific meaning species. So this is when birds lay their eggs in other species' nests. So this is our yellow-billed cuckoo. Unlike some of the cuckoos in South America and Europe and Australia and Africa, these birds aren't only laying their eggs in other birds' nests. The cuckoo parents will raise their own babies, build their own nest, and they will also occasionally lay their eggs in other species' nests, like the northern cardinal. And finally, that leads us to obligate heterospecific brood parasites. These are birds that only lay in other species' nests. And this has evolved 7 different times. 1% of all species are actually brood parasites that we know of. So I'm gonna walk you through each of these different groups just because I think they're really cool. The first is actually a duck species. So this is a black-headed duck of South America. These birds lay their eggs not only in other duck nests, but also in the nests of coots and gulls. And this isn't a problem for these little ducklings because within a day of hatching, they're independent. They can go out and find food on their own. They don't need protection or don't get protection. So it doesn't matter if they're in a gull nest or a coot nest, these little ducklings are just fine. In Africa, a group of finches has evolved brood parasitism. These are indigo birds, cuckoo finches, and these beautiful long-tailed whitas. And these birds often parasitize only one host species per parasite species. So an indigo bird will have its own specific host. And that has led to these kind of amazing evolutionary arms races where the host will evolve some sort of anti-parasitism strategy and the parasites will evolve to match that host strategy. One of these arms races is present in egg color. So here on the left, you see the host species have evolved these kind of miraculous different colored eggs, almost like little Easter eggs. These are the tawny flanked prinias and the red-faced cisticolas, and they have these beautiful eggs, but the cuckoo finches that lay in those nests have very similar looking eggs. So the prinia nests with orange eggs will receive cuckoo finch nests or cuckoo finch orange eggs, and they'll match their host eggs. And this isn't restricted just to eggs. They also will match the host babies. So here's the host, the common waxbill, and here's the pin-tailed whydah parasite that lives with that host. So as you can see, the host has evolved these beautiful, very, very strange structures around the bill of these babies, but the whydah has evolved to look just like them. So you can imagine that this waxbill will be evolving newer and weirder structures, and the whydah will evolve to follow that and will also evolve those really weird, beautiful structures on their beak. Honey guides are another species of parasite. These birds actually have this amazing relationship with people that stretches hundreds of thousands of years, where they will lead humans to honey sources. Humans will open up hives to get the honey, and the honey guides will eat the larvae of those bees from the hives. Honey guides, unlike the cuckoo finches and the other parasitic finches, actually get rid of the host nestlings that they're growing with so they can get all the food and the care from the parent. And they do this with these kind of terrifying looking hooks on their bills. So the baby honey guides have these hooked bills. You can see here, Audubon describes them as deadly hooks on their beaks that they use to stab and slaughter the other non-honey guide chicks in the nest. They say this is a brilliant way to terrorize their victims. But again, they're doing this to monopolize the resources from the parents. That leads us to Old World cuckoos. So you may have seen some of these amazing photos of a gigantic cuckoo baby being fed by its little warbler parent. Cuckoos, kind of like those finches, have evolved some spectacular mimicry. So here's the same species of cuckoo will lay in reed warbler nests or blue-tailed wagtail nests or red-starred or redback shrike nests. And when they lay in the nest, they match the egg color of that host species. They can sometimes match the nestlings as well. So here on the left are the host nestlings that have evolved some amazing weird colors. You know, we most often think of baby birds as being kind of pink, but you see these black ones, you see these yellow ones. And on the right are the cuckoo parasites that have evolved to look like those host babies, which is really cool. Not all cuckoos grow up alongside their host, however. Some have actually evolved to get rid of all the hosts in the nest, and it's the babies themselves that do this. They have very muscular wings and backs, and they will, within a day of hatching, launch the host nestlings or the host eggs outside of that nest, which is pretty amazing. There are also New World cuckoos in Central and South America that are parasites. As I mentioned, our yellow and black-billed cuckoos are not obligate heterospecific brood parasites. They make their own nest and care for their own young, in addition to sometimes parasitizing other species. But something like this other cuckoo, I think this is called a pheasant cuckoo, will never make its own nest, will always parasitize like the cuckoos in the Old World. And last but not least are cowbirds. So some cowbirds are host specific, where they only parasitize one host, occasionally a couple on the side. And other cowbirds will parasitize hundreds of hosts, like our brown-headed cowbird can parasitize over 200 different host species successfully, which is pretty amazing. So that can lead to some interesting evolutionary arms races as well. So on the left here, you see a host called a baywing, named because the babies have these bay-colored wings. And they're parasitized by both screaming cowbirds, seen here in the middle, and shiny cowbirds, seen here on the right. The screaming cowbirds only lay in baywing nests, and so they've evolved to look just like the baywings when they're juveniles. The adults look different, but the juveniles look the same. The shiny cowbird parasitizes hundreds of other nests, and so isn't locked in this evolutionary arms race with baywings, and subsequently hasn't evolved to look like the baywings. So they won't mimic them, and they don't do as well in the nest. They survive less well, they grow less well, which is a neat example of why this mimicry has occurred in some of these other species. And that leads us to the star of today's show, the brown-headed cowbirds. So this is North America's ubiquitous brood parasite. Again, one of these obligate heterospecific brood parasites that never makes its own nest, always lays in a different species' nest. These were called bison birds for a long time because big flocks followed the bison around the Great Plains. There was this kind of pervasive story that they evolved brood parasitism because they were following these moving bison and they couldn't stick around to raise their own babies. But that's likely not why this brood parasitism evolved. Instead, brood parasitism in cowbirds likely evolved in Central America where there were no bison, and then the cowbirds spread to North America from there. Cowbirds can be really common. So here's a picture that I took in Kansas. This is when these cowbirds flock up to leave, to head south for the winter time. And there can be quite a few. So that was just a subset of a bigger group of cowbirds, which if you're a host, this could look a little scary. So now I'll convince you that you should be extra scared of these cowbirds because they're in fact villainous mobsters. And I'll start off with the question, how do cowbirds know when to lay an egg? So you wouldn't want to lay an egg too early before a host starts laying, because the host will be like, I haven't laid an egg, this can't be mine. But you don't want to lay an egg after the host has started incubating its own eggs, because if they're about ready to hatch, your cowbird will never hatch on time and will be outcompeted by the big old host nestlings by the time they hatch. So how do cowbirds know what stage the eggs are in? They may poke holes in host eggs, just use their beak to pop the shell open and see how big the baby is inside of the host egg. They may not always do this, but we know that they do sometimes, and will remove the host egg in the process, or the parents will remove the egg because they don't want a broken egg in their nest. Here in the back is a speckly cowbird egg, and the front is a speckly grasshopper sparrow egg. So if the eggs aren't at the right stage for incubation, you know, the cowbirds fly away and let that nest go, right? No, if they're not at the right incubation stage, if they're too far developed, cowbirds might destroy the whole clutch. And we call this farming because they're sort of laying the seeds of their next parasitism attempt by forcing those host parents to build a new nest and to raise new eggs. This doesn't happen only at the egg laying stage. This can also happen when nestlings are present, where they'll destroy the whole brood to force parents to re-nest. I actually have a video of this happening. It's not bloody or gory or anything, but it is resulting in the death of these baby dickcissels. So if you don't want to see that, look away. So here, a female cowbird flies into this dickcissel nest in my low-res video footage, and she starts haphazardly tossing these sweet baby dickcissels outside of the nest, where they will die on the ground because the parent dickcissels can't pick them back up and put them in the nest. Once those babies hatch, parents have to take care of them, and parental care is really costly. These parents are working full-time to raise their babies. You can see here this grasshopper sparrow male has a beak full of caterpillars that he somehow managed to catch while still having, you know, live wriggling caterpillars in his mouth. I don't know how they do it. And cowbirds don't bother to do that at all. They don't bother to raise their babies. They kind of foist that care upon the host species, almost like they're lazy. So just another reason to dislike them. Cowbird babies, when they hatch, are really large. So here, this bird on the right is a cowbird baby compared to its little grasshopper sparrow sibling on the left. These cowbird babies grow really fast. They might outcompete host babies, leading them to starvation, or they might even trample and kill the host babies. Parents aren't done taking care of cowbirds once they leave the nest. They still need to care for them, even when they've fledged, once they've left it. And this could really stress out the parents, like this little common yellowthroat right here with its big cowbird baby. This isn't my picture. I wish that it were. But so you can expect this parent is overworking itself, feeding this gigantic baby. It's really stressed. This may actually hurt its future reproductive attempts by hurting its health and its condition. Because cowbird parasitism is costly, especially to the small birds that are outcompeted by these fast-growing cowbirds, they may have evolved defenses, such as in the case of the yellow warbler, which often sees a cowbird egg in the nest and will simply build a new nest bottom over top of that cowbird egg, burying the cowbird egg. So the cowbird egg doesn't get touched by the parent, doesn't get incubated, ultimately doesn't hatch. So you can see here in a photo that once again isn't mine, but I like a lot. There is a cowbird egg buried under 4 little yellow warbler eggs, which is really cool. Some hosts, like our American robins, simply grasp the cowbird eggs and reject them from the nest. Just toss them out. They never raise cowbird babies. They always reject them. But interestingly, we know that some cowbird hosts can remove the eggs. So here's another blurry nest cam footage of a grasshopper sparrow. That's the big stripy blob in front. He's gonna reach into his nest and he's gonna roll out a cowbird egg. So he just takes it, rolls it out. That egg won't get incubated, it won't hatch, it won't grow to compete with his babies, which is all well and good. But if you had eagle eyes and saw in this video earlier, there's actually babies already in the nest. And this baby on the right is actually a cowbird baby. So he let some of the cowbirds hatch in his nest and didn't remove those eggs to start with. So if he's capable of removing the eggs, why doesn't he? And this is where the mobster behavior comes in. So this is a real photo that I took of cowbirds and friends in the field. And we know from some other folks' research that cowbirds may actually retaliate if their eggs and babies are rejected or poorly cared for, destroying nests. So the female cowbirds may check back in. If they see that their babies aren't doing well, they'll just destroy the whole nest. And this means that any bird that has a mutation that results in its not taking care of the cowbird baby won't be able to pass that behavior on to its own babies and won't lead to the evolution of anti-cowbird behavior because it won't have any babies to pass that on to because they're dead. So this is what we call the Mafia Hypothesis. And I may have seen this in the fields, I don't know for sure, but here's yet another video of cowbirds herding babies, so look away if you don't want to see it. But in comes a female cowbird to a grasshopper sparrow nest. You can see a baby cowbird begging in the nest and a baby grasshopper sparrow. In comes the cowbird and she drags them both out of the nest. And you can see next to this grasshopper sparrow baby is a cowbird egg that didn't hatch. So I didn't do any genetic analyses. I don't know who this female is, but there's a possibility that that's her own egg and it never hatched, and she is reinforcing her brood parasitism strategy by destroying the clutch and the brood just in case. Another reason to dislike cowbirds is that cowbirds' current range has expanded. They used to be restricted to the grasslands of North America, and when colonizers opened up the forests on the east and west coasts, they've expanded their range since about the 1800s, and now they're expanding into Alaska, down into Mexico, and to both coasts. So as they're expanding, they're encountering birds that never evolved to deal with these cowbirds, especially some vulnerable species, like for instance, the Kirtland's warbler or the black-capped vireo. And in order to save these endangered species, researchers will actually go out and use these funky looking traps to capture adult cowbirds and kill them. As you can imagine, this takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of person power. So cowbirds can certainly be a pain for these species that are already endangered and at risk. So verdict, cowbirds appear to be villainous mobsters. They poke holes in and remove eggs, which reduces host breeding success. They destroy whole clutches, which we call farming. They kill all the nestlings in some cases, which looks like farming, but at the brooding stage, the stage with babies. They don't care for their own kids, even though it's a lot of work. They kind of seem lazy. They can outcompete host offspring, sometimes to the point of starvation or even trampling them. They stress and overwork host parents even long after the nesting is done, after the cowbirds leave. They kill nestlings if the cowbirds aren't taken care of well. That's that Mafia Hypothesis. They're expanding their range, impacting endangered species. It looks like all the evidence suggests that cowbirds are awful, that you shouldn't trust cowbirds, that you should hate them, like some of the hate I've received on Twitter. So now I'm going to turn around and convince you that there are falsely maligned native species instead. So I asked Twitter a few months ago when I was giving this talk to an Audubon club, do you like brown-headed cowbirds? And I made this poll, and the majority of people said yes, about 50%. Some said they wouldn't say like, some said no. But maybe I'm just, preaching to the choir here. Maybe you all love cowbirds. I asked the same Twitter audience if cowbirds are good and asked them why or why not. And again, most people said yes, or it depends. And the vast majority of the answers were something along the lines of, we can't impose human moral standards on a non-human animal. This is an evolved strategy. Cowbirds don't choose to be the way that they are. They're non-human animals. So we can't make judgments about their parenting quality and kill them because of that. And lots of birds hurt other birds. So here's a Cooper's hawk that I was watching last week build his nest, which was really fascinating. And I really enjoyed it. I took something like 200 photos of this bird snapping tree branches off and twigs and bringing them to his nest. And these Cooper's hawks hurt other birds. They'll eat nestlings, they'll eat adults. Why don't we hate them as much as we hate cowbirds? In addition, cowbirds may be expanding their range, but they're still native to North America. And in fact, fossil evidence from the East and West Coast suggests that they've actually lived across most of the continent at some point in history, probably when we had more grasslands across the whole continent. So they are in fact native, unlike what the US Fish and Wildlife Service Twitter account might say. and they're actually declining. So here's some data from New Hampshire, I think, that shows from 1970 all the way to 2010, these cowbirds are declining by about 0.6% per year, which may not sound like a lot, but multiplied over, you know, this 40-year time span, their abundance is really dropping, that being the number of birds there. And we talk about cowbirds as if they're bad parents, but female cowbirds may lay as many as 50 eggs in a breeding season. And laying those eggs is not easy. She has to find the nest to start with. And as a field biologist who spends most of their time looking for nests, I can tell you that that isn't very easy. She needs to know if it's the right host species. She can't be laying in a duck nest, for instance. They're not going to care for their babies. She needs to know if the nest characteristics are right. Will this be a good place for her baby to grow up? She needs to know if the nest is at the right stage, this early laying stage. She can't lay too early. She can't lay too late. She'll check back in on her babies and, you know, retaliate if the babies aren't being well cared for. There's a lot of work that this cowbird puts in. It just doesn't look like classical bird parenting. So cowbirds, I think, are falsely maligned. We can't impose moral standards on a naturally evolved strategy, even if we don't like how it looks. Lots of birds hurt other birds. Predators do it. Why are cowbirds any different? They're a native species and they're in decline. We should be protecting them rather than going out of our way to hurt them. They find nests. They lay up to 50 eggs a year. They check back in on their nestlings. To me, that kind of sounds like they're good moms, albeit in a slightly non-traditional way. So hopefully I've convinced you either that cowbirds are mobsters or they're a falsely maligned native species. But now I'm going to turn to a subject close to my heart as a scientist, and this is cowbirds in research. Once again, I work in a lab that bills itself as the Cowbird Lab. But the first bit of research I'll talk to you about was actually work I did with the Boyle Laboratory when I was a master's student. So my first research project with the Boyle Lab was looking at male territories of grasshopper sparrows. And so I was trying to figure out why these birds will clump their territories in some parts of the prairie and will spread them out evenly in other parts. And I was looking at nest success, thinking maybe the clump males had higher nest success than the evenly spread males or something along those lines. So I was finding grasshopper sparrow nests. I also wanted to know if the babies were actually that male's babies, because they can sometimes be from multiple fathers. So I was taking blood samples from these babies and using that to figure out who dad is. But I didn't want to take the blood samples when the babies were too young because they're really small and their veins are really small. And I didn't want to take the blood samples when they were too old, when I could potentially scare them out of the nest once they're ready to leave. So I shot for the day 6 mark, where all the nestlings were 6 days old. And I was noticing this weird pattern, or lack of pattern perhaps, that sometimes birds look like these on the left, where the birds are relatively grown. They have most of their feathers in already. They're starting to look like adult birds. And they're very large. And that's in contrast to some of the other birds that I found that were the same exact age, but often looked very different. So you can see this one on the bottom, its feathers aren't all the way out yet. And it's substantially larger than its sibling, who doesn't look anything like an adult bird yet, even though it's the same age. So for my master's work, I asked the question, why do grasshopper sparrow babies vary so much in size? In general, I study growth and development strategies, the diversity of these strategies. Organisms grow up in very different ways and require different amounts of care. You can imagine a dandelion baby doesn't grow up the same way as a human baby, for instance. We know that this has impacts on the survival of these offspring, their reproductive success, and the way they go about their lives as organisms or their life history strategies. And I wanted to know what environmental drivers, what in the environment leads to this diversity in growth and development strategies. So I studied this at Conza Prairie Biological Station. So this is a spot in Northeast Kansas, and it's an experimental landscape led by researchers with the National Science Foundation, where across the prairie, we have bison grazing in some areas and cattle in some areas and no grazers in some areas. And we burn the prairie at different frequencies to mimic some natural fire regimes that would have existed in the Great Plains. Some spots are burned every year, some are never burned, some are burned every 20 years. And so it creates this really cool mosaic of different land cover types that leads to a lot of neat bird diversity. It's a great place to work. It's also great to study cowbirds because about 50% of our grasshopper sparrow nests are parasitized. And when they're parasitized, these species are really parasitized in some cases. So these are both dickcissel nests, another species I'll talk about. Dickcissel nests should have these light blue, almost robin's egg blue eggs. Here, this nest has 5 dickcissel eggs, but also 4 cowbird eggs. This nest on the right should have blue dickcissel eggs, but instead only has cowbird eggs. So if these nests are found by cowbirds, they often get a lot of cowbird babies in the nests. I'll just give a plug for the state of Kansas. So we like to think, at least growing up in Ohio, we thought that Kansas was flat and boring. And at least the part of Kansas I worked in, the Flint Hills region, was very hilly. I know this because I had to walk up all these hills carrying like 40 pounds of equipment. And it can be very, very beautiful. So plug for Kansas. In Kansas, I studied 3 different hosts of cowbirds. The biggest one was the eastern meadowlark. So this is one of the largest successful hosts of cowbirds, successful meaning that cowbirds can actually survive and leave the nest. You can see these 2 meadowlark eggs are substantially larger than the 4 cowbird eggs in the nest. And these 2 kind of gray and yellowish striped babies are meadowlarks, and they're much bigger than this little cowbird baby that's kind of tucked underneath them. My medium-sized hosts were dickcissels. They're about the exact same size as cowbirds. They lay these light blue eggs compared to the cowbird's speckled eggs. And the hosts are this nice kind of creamy brown color compared to the cowbird's gray color. And finally, my small host was the grasshopper sparrow. They're about 1/3 the size of cowbird babies. They lay these white eggs with brown speckles compared to this big old cowbird egg. And you can see here this gigantic, kind of ugly looking cowbird nestling with the tiny grasshopper sparrow nestling. So first I had to confirm that there was a difference in the way these birds grow. So I'm going to show you a graph. On the axis here, on the vertical axis, is the mass of the birds, so how much they weigh. And on the bottom axis is their age in days. So as you can imagine, their mass is going to go up as they get older. And in fact, it does, which is great. No birds are getting smaller. I have meadowlarks in purple, dickcissels in orange, and grasshopper sparrows in blue. And you can see that instead of all of the babies following the same trajectory, following one line, there's a pretty good spread of variation. So you have, for instance, meadowlark babies that by day 9 are like, 24 grams, but also individuals of the same exact species of meadowlarks that are like 50 grams or almost 60 grams. So that's a big difference. We have birds that are, double the size of the same species when they're the same age. So there is this large within species variation in mass gain and also leg length and wing length and beak length, all these other things that I studied. I want to know what's causing that variation. And I looked to cowbirds. So brood parasitism, I thought, would directly impact growth rate. I expected, especially for the small grasshopper sparrow hosts, that having a cowbird in the nest would suppress their growth. I also thought food would be important, where the birds that receive more food would grow faster. And I thought that predator risk might be important, where the birds that thought there were more predators nearby would grow faster so they could leave the nest and avoid these predators. And I thought that brood parasitism might also affect those things. So brood parasites, these cowbirds, beg a lot. They always beg for food, even when they're not necessarily hungry in some cases. So I thought that that might entice the parents to bring more food to the nest, which could indirectly affect host rate. So much they could be attracting more predators. So I thought that brood parasitism might impact predation risk and impact that host growth rate. What did I find? No evidence of any significant environmental impacts on growth rate, not even direct impacts of cowbirds, which is pretty miraculous because these grasshopper sparrows in particular are so small compared to cowbirds. So this preliminary evidence shows no effect of cowbirds, even though cowbirds can be 3 times the size of grasshopper sparrow babies. How are they doing this? However they are, it seems like historic hosts of the brown-headed cowbird, these birds in the grassland that evolved with cowbirds, are capable of raising cowbirds with few consequences to the growth and development of their nestlings. That stands in contrast to something like this Kirtland's warbler, which suffers a ton of consequences and often loses all their babies when there's a cowbird in the nest. So who's paying the cost of cowbirds? It could be that these parents are simply overworking themselves to bring enough food to the nest for these babies. And that's something we're exploring further. So cowbirds could still be costly. It's just not being experienced at the level of nestling growth and development like I thought that it would be. There's a lot of other questions you can ask about how host parents deal with cowbirds. So I've already mentioned that yellow warblers will bury cowbird eggs when they find them, but they also have evolved some strategies to avoid cowbird eggs being laid at all to start with. And this is the work of Shelby Lawson, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois with me. So Shelby knows that these yellow warblers have a specific call that they make that means cowbird. So like in the language of a yellow warbler, they can say cowbird, it sounds like seat, and that will entice females to rush back to their nest, sit on their eggs, and protect their nest from cowbirds by physically preventing the cowbirds from laying an egg. But amazingly, Shelby has also found that the local red-winged blackbirds are listening in on these yellow warblers, and they can understand the special yellow warbler call, and they respond as if a cowbird is nearby when they hear it. So it's like they've cracked the language of yellow warblers to learn about cowbird risk, which is really neat. I study robins now for my PhD. And we know that, as I mentioned, robins reject cowbird eggs. So what can that teach us about robins themselves, about their behavior, about their cognition, their brain functioning? What can we learn about robins? Robins are nice to work with. Their nests are really easy to find. So here you can see a robin nest in a tiny little hedge. I work in arbors now in Illinois that aren't necessarily as pretty as the prairies, but I do like them, and I like finding many, many robin nests. Excuse me. So robins, one second. So we know that robins, accept fake 3D printed eggs if you paint them robin's egg blue. So here is 4 robin eggs in a nest with a blue cowbird, or with a blue robin egg. This is actually 3D printed, it's fake, it's plastic. I put it in the nest and the robins are none the wiser. They accept that egg, they incubate it as if it's their own, and it works out really well. If you put a 3D printed egg that's painted royal blue, sometimes the robins understand that that's not a robin egg and they'll kick it out. That's about 50% of the time they reject royal blue eggs. If you 3D print a cowbird egg, they always reject that 3D printed egg. But we wanted to know if the presence of a cowbird egg makes them more suspicious of potential brood parasites. So if they found a cowbird egg in the nest one day, are they on high alert for future brood parasitism? And it turns out they are. So if you show them a cowbird egg, they'll reject it. And the next day, if you show them a royal blue egg, they'll reject it more than 50% of the time. Remember, 50% of the time is like the normal amount of time they reject it. So it's almost as if this seeing the cowbird primes them to be worried about parasitism, which is neat and tells us some cool things about how robins work. We know that robins, because they reject these eggs, we can ask questions about what they perceive as an egg. So birds clean their nest. If like a leaf falls in it, they'll pick it out. So we want to know at what point the robins think something's an egg and what point they think it's some trash in the nest. And because they reject eggs, because they've evolved this cowbird defense, we can put some eggs in the nest that we've printed to look sort of weird, like this one that kind of looks like a dice, and ask at what point they'll think something's an egg or not think something's an egg. So we've done some pretty cool work with that too. Some other folks in my lab that I want to give a shout out to. So Nick Antonsen and Hannah Scharf work with prothonotary warblers and the cowbirds that parasitize them. So Hannah works with the prothonotary babies and Nick actually looks at the cowbird babies themselves. So that leads me to another question. What can research tell us about cowbirds' growth and behavior? So when I was measuring all these babies in Kansas, there were also cowbirds in the nest. So I'm like, okay, why not also measure the cowbird babies? So I expected there'd be a host species effect on cowbird growth. I expected that they would grow really, really well when they have tiny little grasshopper sparrow competitors, and they'd grow less well when they are competing with those gigantic meadowlark nestlings. And I thought this would interact with food availability, where potentially the host species would bring different levels of food and the cowbird would grow differently because of these differences in food, in addition to the differences in competition. So here I'm going to show you the number of visits that the parents make with food per nestling per hour. So just know higher numbers means more food for babies. And I'm going to show you that for the different species, Emi for eastern meadowlark, Dick for dick thistle, and Gers for grasshopper sparrow. And as you can see, there's some differences. So a meadowlark baby or a cowbird in a meadowlark nest will receive fewer than one visit per hour. So it's less than something like a dick thistle that receives more than one visit per hour. And for grasshopper sparrows, we found a really big range where some parents will visit only once per nestling per hour, and some will visit almost 3 times per nestling per hour. So are these cowbirds growing differently in these nests where they receive different food? And the preliminary results suggest that cowbird young experiencing these dramatically different conditions within their nests do grow differently. They grew best in the smallest host nests that brought the most food, these grasshopper sparrows, and had less competition. And they grew the worst in the biggest host nests that had the most competition and had the least amount of food. Once I moved to start my PhD, I had this nice cowbird data set waiting for me. It was collected in 2008 when I was in 8th grade, but the data were still very good. So I was able to ask some questions about cowbird growth and some additional species, in this case, the red-winged blackbird and the song sparrow. And I found that cowbirds grow faster in the song sparrow nests than the red-winged blackbird nests, perhaps because the song sparrows are smaller and pose less competition for these cowbirds like in my grassland system. And so here I have, once again, the mass of the birds on the vertical axis, how much they weigh, and the day of development on the bottom axis. And you can see that on this dotted line, the song sparrow cowbirds, these are cowbirds growing in song sparrow nests, do get to a bigger size and grow faster in this middle period than the cowbirds in red-winged blackbird nests. So that by day 8, the baby cowbirds have reached a larger size in the nests of these smaller song sparrows. In addition to this research with these data, I also wanted to test this funky hypothesis we came up with called the growth tuning hypothesis that posits that cowbirds will tune their growth to the developmental period of their host nestmates. And so I'll walk you through this because it's a little complicated. So if you're a cowbird, if you're a parasite, you're going to spend some time, some portion of your time in the nest as an egg and some portion of your time as a nestling. If you're growing up with a host that grows faster, it's going to spend less time as an egg or less time as a nestling or both. And there's going to be this period where you're a nestling while they have left the nest. And if this is the case, the parents will often follow the host babies away from the nest and leave the cowbirds to starve. And I've actually seen this happen in dick thistle nests where the dick thistles left early. That's in contrast to a host that perhaps has longer incubation times or longer times as nestlings. If they're longer than the cowbird has no reason to grow faster. And then actually fast growth can be bad in some cases. So it's like, why bother to grow fast if you don't need to? So we looked at some previously published data from other scientists and some new data from my co-authors, and we did find support for this growth tuning hypothesis. So here on the vertical axis is the mass of these birds on day 8. So you'd expect the ones with a higher mass towards the top of the graph to have grown faster than the ones on the bottom of the graph. And on the bottom axis, we have host developmental period. So over on the left-hand side are longer developmental periods, the ones where cowbirds shouldn't grow as fast. So we'd expect that cowbirds growing over on this left side of the graph will be towards the bottom. And then on the right side of this axis, we have the host developmental periods being shorter. So we'd expect cowbirds to be a little bit higher on this portion of the graph if they grew faster to match this shorter development time. And that's what we saw. So in a host like an eastern phoebe that takes a while to grow up, cowbirds grow slower and they don't hit as high a mass as they would in something that develops much faster, like a chestnut-sided warbler. And finally, one last nice tidbit. It's interesting that cowbirds will grow up with host nests, and that raises the question, how does a cowbird know it's a cowbird? Why doesn't it think it's a common yellowthroat? So this was some work done quite a while ago now by my PhD advisor, Mark Halber. And he found that adult cowbirds give this special call called a chatter call, and it acts as a password that unlocks the baby cowbird's identity in its brain. And we know on a genetic level how this happens now. So it's pretty amazing that researchers have been able to ask these sort of questions, everything from how hosts respond to what we can tell about robin cognition, to how these baby cowbirds are growing, to how these cowbirds know if they're a cowbird, because of this miraculous behavior that these cowbirds do. So whether or not you think cowbirds are villainous mobsters or falsely maligned native species, I hope that I've at least convinced you that they're cool to research. And as a scientist, as a biologist, I definitely believe in that. But I'll also mention that I'm often accused of being a cowbird apologist, where people think that I like cowbirds a little bit too much. Because often online, I'll try to convince people to not remove cowbird eggs from nests and not kill adult cowbirds. So I'm going to end my talk by just walking you through why you shouldn't remove cowbird eggs. As I mentioned, Audubon has actually done articles about this, asking if it's okay to remove cowbird eggs from host nests. And this isn't just like some made up problem. It actually happens. People actually do this. I asked Twitter again if people would remove a cowbird egg from the nest if it was legal. Most people said no. Some people said it depends. And in the comments clarified that they're like, if it's an endangered species, I try to save them, an endangered host species, and that makes sense. A very small subset did say yes, only like 7.5%. But 7.5% of the 341 people that voted is still 26 people that said they would remove cowbird eggs if they could. It's still a lot of dead, declining native birds, right? And this happens. The incoming president of the American Ornithological Society actually stepped down this summer when it was revealed he'd removed a cowbird egg from a vireo nest. So this is a problem. I don't know how widespread it is, but it is something that I spend some time convincing people not to do online. So don't remove cowbird eggs. They're a native species in decline, as I've mentioned numerous times. They're also protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act because they're a native species. It's a federal crime. Don't do it. You'll stress out the host parents simply by approaching the nest. Every time I take one of these photos of, in this case, a dickcissel nest that's particularly lovely, I'm stressing out those host parents. And I could contribute to the failure of the nest just because the parents are stressed. So don't go to nests to remove cowbird eggs. Don't go to nests in general. I know it's tempting, but it can hurt birds. And again, I only do it for the nests I research. I don't do it for other species' nests. you may be, in removing these eggs, convincing the host parent that predators are nearby. So many birds we know can count. They can look at their nest and be like, okay, there were 4 eggs here before, and now there's only 3. A snake probably came by and ate one. And they're not going to bother to invest more time and energy into that nest if they know that it's ultimately doomed. So they might just abandon that nest altogether, not raise any of the babies, and you've destroyed the whole nest when you removed that one cowbird egg. As I've mentioned, cowbirds are mobsters. They're going to check in potentially on their host or on their eggs to make sure that the hosts are taking care of them. And if they see that their egg is gone, they may destroy the host nest. So you may be dooming that nest and the host that you're trying to protect by removing a cowbird egg. And if that doesn't convince you, just know that I'm a cowbird apologist and I love cowbirds. I like the ways the babies sit on my fingers when I measure them. It makes me feel like a princess. And I will be very disappointed if you post something online saying you remove cowbird eggs. Don't do it. With that, I would love to take any questions. Here's my contact information again. I will pull up the chat so I can see everybody. And thank you so much.
All right, so first things first, can I get a round of virtual applause for Sarah here? Thank you so much. I think my favorite conclusion of any presentation ever is basically, don't do this illegal thing, because also it's gonna make me sad. So with that said, do people have questions? Please go ahead and slap them in the chat here. I know that was a lot of information and you're probably buzzing with all the new facts that have been laid on here, but go ahead and put your questions in the chat here and we can have Sarah answer them for us. And I will make a quick note. Somebody in the chat pointed out earlier that while introducing Sarah, I said she on accident. That was a misgendering. Sarah prefers to go by they, them, so I apologize for that.
Thank you so much.
So, okay, cool. We got a question from Beth. Beth, would you like to actually unmute yourself and ask your question in person?
Oh, when I saw that they were predating the Grasshopper Sparrow's nest, they're so much in decline, especially in DuPage County. It made me sad, but yeah. I just didn't know that if one species is in steep decline because of the predation, or is that as a major contributing factor, is there anything that can be done?
So for the grasshopper sparrows, you're right. In general, they're in decline. Some of the numbers are terrifying, like 60% since like in the last 50 years. We're losing grasshopper sparrows. We're actually losing all grassland birds. They're, of all the types of birds, they're the most in decline. We think that predation hasn't really changed. So if you look at some site like Kanza, a researcher just today presented his work showing that there hasn't been a difference since the 70s in the amount of birds that have been eaten by predators, at least babies, but there has been an increase in this cowbird parasitism. So it could be that the cowbirds are stressing out the parents so much, even if they're not affecting the growth of these grasshopper sparrow babies, and they're ultimately leading to further reproductive failure for these sparrows. If researchers can prove that, and if we decide to care enough about grasshopper sparrows, you could start a program where you trap adult cowbirds and kill them. And that can prevent all those problems with removing eggs from nests. It can prevent the retaliation and all these things. Like I said, cowbirds can lay 50 eggs a year, so getting rid of one female cowbird might be important. So that's something that could possibly be done, but we don't have that evidence necessarily yet. And as my research shows, they don't seem to be hurting grasshopper sparrow babies, but I do love grasshopper sparrows. Maybe too much information, but I have a grasshopper sparrow tattoo. I really like them. So I'm very worried about their declines as much as I love cowbirds too. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I was kind of rambly.
Yes, thank you. It's still, yeah, boy, the balance of nature is so whacked out.
Yeah. And in general, most grassland birds are in decline just because we've gotten rid of grasslands. So that would be, if you're worried about grassland birds and birds in general, the #1 thing to do would be to restore habitats and make sure habitats are high quality.
Yep. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
We got a question here from Pam. Pam, would you like to unmute yourself and ask that question?
Yeah, I was just, if we could imagine a world where there were no cowbirds, would that be detrimental in some way? Or to flip that around, are they somehow actually beneficial in ways that might be hard for us to envision given their, you know, behavior that is a little different?
Yeah. So I don't know. It depends on whose perspective you're asking. Me as a cowbird researcher, I'd say they're pretty awesome and the world is better because of them. But we also see some interesting patterns. So when I looked at the nest predation at nests with cowbirds, I actually found the opposite of the pattern I predicted, that nests with cowbirds were eaten less often than nests without cowbirds. And you might even, maybe not in the species I study, but in other species, find some benefit for host nestlings because these cowbirds beg so much. They actually might entice parents to bring food more often, and that may benefit the host nestlings as well. So there might be these tiny little benefits to host nestlings. They get eaten a little bit less often, they get a little bit more food, that despite stressing the parent birds might add up to increased survival for these host species. In general, I think cowbirds are definitely more of a problem than a positive for host species. Give me 1 second, I'm gonna plug in my computer.
See a few more questions, but if you guys have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll see if we can get to them here before we're done with the program.
Sorry, my cat unplugged my computer. But yeah, I don't think cowbirds are beneficial to their hosts, but at the same time, are predators beneficial to hosts? Should we be hating on birds that aren't beneficial like hawks? So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, that's a great answer. And even just what you mentioned about, you know, maybe the babies of the host get a little more food or something. There could be these sort of hidden pluses. It's not all bad. So yeah, no, I'm with you there. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'll also point out that, I mean, there's even examples here in Chicago or where we see kind of these questions of, do we need to control other birds in some form or fashion? Even with like our piping plovers in Chicago, there was decisions made to, for example, move killdeer nests out of the site nearby because killdeers are known to be aggressive to plovers and plovers are highly endangered. So it's always a very difficult conversation to have no matter the context. Let's see, we have a question here from Lois. Oh, no, sorry, Jenna is next. Oh, and actually I was wondering about this one too. Jenna, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So since cowbirds can lay up to 50 eggs a year and they need to match kind of the timing with the host species, can they lay their multiple eggs at once, and how much time goes by until they can lay another egg?
It's generally about 1 day. So they're not gonna, physiologically, they're constrained to only producing 1 egg per day. But you can imagine if the breeding season stretches from, you know, April through August, that's a lot of days if they can lay every single day. So there are some bird species like parrots, I think, that can only lay like every few days, but cowbirds can do it every single day, just like the host species can.
Lois.
Will the female bird kind of be keeping her eye on multiple nests at once? Like, oh, this nest won't be ready till 3 days from now. I'll go lay in this other one today.
I would love to be able to answer that. We don't know a lot about female cowbirds. The technology that we use to track birds has gotten really better in the last few years. It's gotten lighter, so we can put these trackers on smaller birds. But no one has yet put them on cowbirds. No one has tracked a cowbird to see which nest she has located, which one she's currently laying in. there's not a lot of research on what the female cowbirds are doing in the wild. So it could be the case that she's got like a list in her head of, 20 nests, and she's keeping track and checking back in on her nestlings in those nests and waiting for ones to get to the right stage. We just don't know. But if I had $1 million, I would hire so many people to track cowbird females and help me study that. It'd be amazing.
Okay, we got a question from Janet. Janet Dawson, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, if I understood right, you were talking about species that are able to tailor, effectively they've evolved to be able to kind of tailor their eggs to match the other ones in the nest. Does each female kind of just do one type of egg, or are they actually able to say, oh, this is a whatever nest, and I can lay the right type of egg in this one and then go to another nest and lay a different type of egg there?
I think in every species that we know of for sure, it's that a female has a specific nest that she always parasitizes. Mm-hmm. So like one cuckoo will always lay a reed warbler colored egg, and another cuckoo will lay, a redstart colored egg. And that's actually passed mother to daughter, I think, in some of the cuckoos that have been studied.
Great, thank you.
Alrighty, I don't see any other questions, but I am seeing some comments where if you do happen to get that boatload of money to do more cowbird research, you have a very ready and willing group here who would all love to be hired as your field techs for that.
It would be so much fun. I would hire you all and we could chase cowbirds all over the prairies and all over Illinois.
Oh, we are so down for that. So on that note, I think I'm going to go ahead and close it out here. Again, a huge virtual round of applause here for Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating. Really appreciate your time this evening to talk with us all and share your knowledge. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And to everybody else here, again, thank you all so much for joining us here. This program is for you guys, so we really appreciate your time this evening to join us and learn about birds with us here. If you are not already a member of COS, why not? It helps fund amazing programs like this one, which are free and open to the public. And additionally, it goes to all kinds of other projects, including numerous conservation projects here in the Chicago region that, like Sarah said, do help support bird populations in our area. So hop on over to our website, chicagobirder.org. Take a look, see, we've got a great calendar of events, of virtual programs and in-person programs, and consider becoming a member if you're not already. But on that note, I'm going to go ahead and close it out this evening. Once again, thank you everybody for being here. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you guys on another program or in the field sometime in the future here. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.